intervention. Kiran Oommen is a Malayali American community organizer, gardener, and musician based in Seattle, Washington. In addition to their work as a plaintiff on the Juliana v. U.S. lawsuit, they're on the board of directors for the Civil Liberties Defense Center and associate with a variety of direct action groups in the Pacific Northwest. Kiran got their BA in sociology at Seattle University. Currently, they play in the ecofeminist power violence band Pickaxe and book underground punk concerts in Seattle. So the way this will work is Lee and Kiran will engage in a conversation about the contents of Lee's book, and then we'll open up the floor to a Q&A from audience members for the last 10 or 15 minutes. Please feel free to use the chat box to indicate if you have a question during the presentation. Afterwards, we'll use that to run the Q&A portion. And of course, you're free to use the chat box for any other messages that you feel need to be sent as well. Also, of course, the link to buy As the World Burns will be put in the chat shortly. I highly encourage you to buy Lee's book from us. Not only will you be supporting Lee as an author, but also Grassroots as a small local indie bookstore that is able to bring events like this your way. So all that being said, feel free to take it away, Lee.
Okay then. Yeah, and support for these great plaintiffs too. I mean, this is actually a really, I think this lawsuit will be remembered as one of the most important pieces of litigation of our time. It is really landmark climate litigation, and I'm very happy to have been involved in reporting it and writing these stories, and grateful to the plaintiffs and their legal team for kind of letting me tag along. The book starts off actually with the cancellation of their trial, which was supposed to occur in October 2018 and didn't happen. And it follows the plaintiffs through the year of waiting for trial to resume, which came with a lot of legal obstacle and gymnastics, and also just against the backdrop of like the very weird times that we've been living in. So I'll let the book tell that story. Lots has happened since then. The book leaves off in the beginning of this year. And, you know, we all know there's tons going on in the world, everything from pandemic to racial uprising and unrest, and also tons of activism still around the environment, plus a really consequential presidential election. And I kind of want to hand it to Kiran a little bit to just talk about, you know, what's going on in the world and what's your sense of how the activism that you've been so involved with for so long and your climate work kind of dovetails with the rest of what's happening in the world.
Yeah, I mean, so I've been involved in the case since I was a teenager, but also since even before the case, I was involved in kind of the direct action movement, specifically on environmental issues. And what I mean by that is direct action is just sort of like an activist tactic for those who aren't aware of just sort of stopping what you think needs to be stopped, rather than going through sort of the traditional route of like asking politicians to do it for you, or like the next level would be going to the courts to sort of put pressure or like to like change the legal system. And then if none of those things work, like the last thing that people usually try is like actually stopping. So like if they're building, you know, an oil refinery in a climate crisis, then a direct action would be to like blockade the construction. And so I haven't decided what is going to solve, or I have no idea what's going to solve climate change. So I've been involved in a lot of these different things, different tactics. But at the same time, being a person of color, being queer, being like an intersectional human being and activist, like I haven't been able to avoid the other activist movements, including, you know, anti-racist, like abolition movements, and, you know, like feminist movements and various things that are happening and using various tactics, of course. I think what's interesting now is that racial justice has been pushed to the forefront of the conversation, not just in the activist circles where it was already, but now in the mainstream, to the point where a lot of activists are like who maybe have cared but haven't, you know, been dedicating as much time and energy as they should or could be now to racial justice now are. So I've just seen a lot of those conversations, folks I've organized with for years in the climate movement. I've oftentimes been the only person of color at meetings, the only person of color in groups. I grew up in Eugene. I'm in Eugene right now, which is a generally white place. And I haven't complained a lot about that or anything, but it's like all of a sudden people are like asking me about my experiences that like they haven't asked, for years and years. So I've just seen a lot of kind of like cultural shifts in the mainstream and in the activist circles of like how serious we take racism. And I think it's awesome.
Is it awkward for you to be asked questions like that? Do you feel sometimes like, I'm answering for maybe having to do other people's homework?
Yeah, I mean, that's something a lot of people talk about, is like, the burden on people of color talking about racial issues and educating on racial issues. I think what people talk about, what I think I've experienced more, like I've certainly experienced that in the past, but I think that conversation, even that conversation is brought out is a more common conversation that folks have. Um, so what I actually think is that people are becoming, especially white folks, are becoming more aware of a lot of these like things that are going on that they might not have been aware of before, because suddenly like the whole country is in turmoil with like riots like we haven't seen in a long, long time happening over an issue that so many activists I know haven't really been organizing around. Like I know loads of activists who really care about making the world a better place and have kind of found their movement, and maybe that's not racial justice. And now it's kind of like it can't not be racial justice. So, you could see it as like, you could see it as that, pressure, but I can't speak for other people, but in my experience it's actually been like, oh, like actually I love that you're interested in talking about this now.
That's pretty great. And I mean, you make the good point that like it can't not be part of your cause. And I think in the climate movement, like the overlapping interest in racial equity and climate justice is like really, really hard to ignore. Just because we know so many people of color and marginalized communities are kind of on the front lines of environmental injustices. And I wonder if would you feel comfortable talking a little bit about how that plays into Juliana v. US?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so there's 21 plaintiffs, all between the ages of 20, 24, must be like 12 and 24 now. I guess it's been, and some time has passed. But the plaintiffs come from all different corners of the country and many different backgrounds. There are white plaintiffs, there are indigenous plaintiffs, there are like multiracial plaintiffs, there are plaintiffs who are, black and brown and have very different experiences. And each plaintiff's story, I suppose, if you read Lee's book, you'll kind of get more backgrounds on like the different ways they come. But I think an important part of the case is that, is the argument that, there are people feeling the effects of climate change right now, and that is like impeding our ability, that is a violation of our constitutional rights, some of these effects of climate change, and a lot of that is happening to marginalized communities, as you said. So I would say like our case, which has been going on for a long time, was like trying to make that connection. Environmental justice is the common term, of like, how is not only like how are we hurting the environment, but how is our society hurting the environment, hurting other members of our society?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'll kind of dip in a little bit to a couple of these stories because I think they're really important. A few of your plaintiffs really represent some of this, like your co-plaintiffs, very, very well. For example, Miko Vergen, who was born in the Marshall Islands and was adopted in the United States. And for folks who don't know, Marshall Islands is 6 feet above sea level and becoming inundated with water. And the option really for people who are Marshallese is like, you're going to build higher, you're going to move. And building higher hasn't necessarily attracted a whole lot of funding from around the world to make that happen. Mika's really working hard for people to see and appreciate the story of her community in that way. And similarly, Journey Zephyr is in Hawaii, and a lot of folks, even Marshallese folks, have moved, about a third really, into Hawaii and Guam as they resettle for economic opportunity and in the future potentially for related to climate issues. And just a few years ago, the White House Council on Environmental Quality held a symposium on climate displacement, migration, and relocation, basically trying to advise Hawaiians to voluntarily leave that island because they foresee that in the future being able to live in Hawaii is going to be very challenging because of the issues that community faces. So I was kind of hoping to just read a section. I mean, people talk a lot about the island communities and I mean, there are other plaintiffs who we could talk about their island impacts, right? But I think maybe what's not so clearly known sometimes is that mainland Americans are beginning to experience displacement, maybe have been for some years, and it's not really talked about as a climate issue. But for example, storms that we know are climate-related events. Hurricane Michael displaced almost 500,000 people. The Woolsey fire, about almost 200,000 people. The Camp Fire, another 50,000. And, FEMA's already got like tens of thousands of people out of areas and homes damaged by Katrina, by Sandy. It's kind of a growing issue, and it's maybe less well understood as you get further and further into the interior. Like, we talk about fire a lot as a climate issue, but I just want to read a really brief passage from Jamie Butler's experience. And Jamie grew up on the Navajo Nation, and something to know about Navajo Nation is it is very experiencing severe drought, less rainfall, very little snow, incredibly what not well known is about a third of people, about a third of the Navajo Nation right now is covered in sand. Sand dunes are like a growing problem, and they move around. They've swamped out roads, they've swamped horse corrals, they're coming for people's homes. There's actual talk about relocating people out of the way of sand. So I just want to read a little bit about the human experience of that. We can just kind of chat some more. Growing up here, Jamie learned about climate change when she was 9. When she joined Juliana v. United States at 14, she did it for the animals because she worried about what climate change would do to them. But Jamie worries more today about what climate change will do to her and to other Navajo people like her. Sometimes these concerns about harms to the animals and harms to the Dene are more or less the same concerns. The summer of 2013 underscores what she means. That year, the drought lasted into what used to be the rainy season, and the wild horses that roamed free, many were dying of thirst. There were reports of horses with ribs sticking out, horses found dead at a dried up watering holes, and horses who tried to kick their way into watering tanks for a drink. The horses were a new kind of problem generally. The land was already overtaxed by drought, and the horse population was meanwhile growing larger all the time. The Navajo had lived peacefully with feral horses for decades, but with the drought, they had to confront the reality of the land not being able to support the horses along with all the rest. The Dene were having cultural clashes over what should be done, whether the horses ought to be rounded up and adopted off the reservation or sold. Such talk collided with traditional values, like the value to just let the horses be. But no matter their feelings, people cared about the horses and did not want to see them suffer. That summer, the drought in the central part of the reservation was especially unyielding. In one report, the Navajo Times relayed the tale of a herd fighting for a wet patch of mud where a faucet had dripped. Their bodies queued up so thick it was impossible to tell until after they were loaded into trailers, too tired and malnourished to fight, what the commotion was even about. Only after they were cleared away did the tiny spot of wet ground show. A few years later, in the spring of 2018, brought drought so severe that Jamie remembers it more starkly than most. The winter was drier than ever before, the spring runoff sparse, and there was no snowpack to feed the watering holes where the horses and livestock went to drink when the rivers ran dry. In one part near Cameron, there's just this little flat part that absorbs a ton of water, Jamie says. She talks about a stock pond where animals have long come for water in the worst of times, the water brackish and left to the wild. That year it was a sliver of itself, and what water was there was being swallowed slowly by the dusty soil underneath. The sparse water on dry soil, the two mixed like porridge, not like something you could drink. It just became quicksand. Right in the middle of it, there was just a small pond, a little puddle, basically. And because there was no water in the area, all the wild horses around there came and tried to get that water. More than 110 horses died in the mud, maybe more than could be safely counted after others slipped deep underground. Their bodies were found in a ring around the puddle, their coats caked in hardened earth from struggling for anything to drink. The ground around this muddy circle was dusty. It held the bones of dead horses past, and later it was encircled in barbed wire so officials could move on to what came next, excavating bodies to deter scavenging birds and dogs, avoid disease, and clear out the smell. It's just kind of rough seeing things go down that we have no control over. It affects everyone, Jamie says. And she kind of goes on to talk about like how this severe drought affects the elders and makes it harder to get water, and how if the elders can't stay out in the desert in their hogans, there's less ways for traditional values and culture to be passed on because young people can't learn from them. So the ripple effects are really terrible, and it's just to highlight maybe one story that illuminates a bit of what we're saying here about sometimes people from marginalized cultures are having these really severe impacts that aren't quite as visible. And Kiran, we kind of talked a little bit about like this can be rural people too. Like rural people are pretty on the front lines, and you had that experience with the fires, right?
Yeah, a little more background about myself. I used to live in Seattle. This summer I moved to the coastal range, which is stolen Siuslaw land, also known as Walton. But I live like very far. I live like out in the woods now, sort of outside of Eugene, I guess. And when the fires came, we actually did pretty well, but we definitely had a moment where we had like go bags packed up, and we thought like our little house and everything was gonna like burn down if the winds changed, and we were like ready to leave. And I must say that was a little bit of a different experience that was like kind of an experience that definitely made me think about a lot of things, especially just like it just makes, climate change more real. Cause like I've been seeing forest fires. I've lived in the Pacific Northwest all my life. And I've seen how the forest fires are getting basically steadily worse every year, every 2 years. Many of you probably have noticed that too. And so this year was like the first time that I was like, oh shit, like had a bit of a fire scare. So like what's going to happen next year? That's the worry, That's why a lot of us have joined this case and have joined this fight, is because it's like, well, we're still alive, but will we have the things that we need to thrive if things go the way that they're continuing to go?
Is this the future that you imagined when you joined the lawsuit, or is this sooner? What were you expecting versus what you have?
I mean, yeah, it's not. Do you mean the fire? Is there a yes? Yeah, I mean, to be honest, when I joined the lawsuit, I didn't think that the tides were turning quite yet. That's kind of why I joined the lawsuit, is because I was worried that the tides weren't turning fast enough. And there were all of these kind of apocalyptic, foretellings about how bad things were going to get when like climate change got worse and worse as it is happening. But at the same time, it's like hard to really get it's hard to like really understand what that means, you know. It's like you hear how terrible things will be, but it's like, but it's not yet, so like we're fine, right? But it's like some of us aren't really satisfied with that.
Yeah, and everything's not fine. Clearly not fine.
Definitely not
It
fine,
seems
yeah.
like the future is now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, can you talk a little bit about just how your rural lifestyle kind of connects to your position in the climate movement? Is it very different living off in the woods versus living in a place like Seattle or Eugene?
Yeah, I mean, I lived in Seattle for about 5 years in the, you know, the middle of the biggest city in the Pacific Northwest, and now I live very far away from one of the medium-sized cities. You know, I'm like it's pretty much, I couldn't have gotten more, I couldn't have done a bigger change. And part of it was reconnecting with nature, you know, as an environmentalist and also just as a human. I mean, like my ancestors on one side of my family immigrated from India in my dad's generation, and back in India they lived, like, and I visited a couple of times, and like I still have family who live in India, and they have a much closer relationship to nature, to plants, you know, to growing food. I have one great uncle who has like a what, you know, what we might call an organic farm. And in the US, I feel like this kind of disconnect because I don't have that sort of ancestral knowledge about how to live off the land, how to live with plants, what to grow, how to grow things. And I see that gap that happened. So I just had this, you know, desire to kind of like learn, you know, because I'm not from India, I'm from the Pacific Northwest, but it's like the closest that I can get to that kind of, you know, that ancestral wisdom that I have lost is like to learn how to grow food and how to live closer to nature here. And I love the Pacific Northwest. So I think that our relationship to nature is clearly at the, you know, our relationship to each other through cycles of domination and our relationship to nature through similar cycles of domination, I think, is at the heart of the climate catastrophe in general. So rethinking, you know, not to personalize, not to make it all, it's not about the individual, of course, but I do think, you know, like reconnecting with nature is important. And I think if more people did that, I think we'd be living in an entirely different world. Not to say everyone should move to the country, but I know it's not for everyone. But for me, I think it's a pretty important part of my journey, and just figuring out how I'm doing here.
Do you find that the people around you in the country share your values?
It's interesting. I would say there's like a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of different opinions out in the country. I'm not the only sort of radical environmentalist who lives out there. And then there's obviously, you know, conservatives, Trumpers, you know, with signs, and everyone kind of lives a little more spread out. So there's a little less possibility for tension, but there's still definitely tensions. And there's still people who make friends across political lines. I think maybe even more so than what I experienced living in the city, to be honest. But I will say I think I'm hoping that I'm hoping more young folks, I'm hoping more people of color, I'm hoping more queer folks will move out to the country. I don't think I'm not sure if that's quite happening yet. Maybe it is. Maybe we're on the cusp of it. Definitely the only non-white person in the town that I live in, and aware of that. And I mean, I think the biggest thing I noticed is in the fires, some conservative media was spreading this like sort of false misinformation that like Antifa was like causing these forest fires in Oregon, and there was some militias that actually set up and were like stopping people, and there was a militia that like stopped friends of my friends like in the next door town, and our neighbors came over and were like, you should like probably not leave the property, and if you do, like try and wear normal clothes and like not look suspicious, because like even though I live, you know, it's my neighborhood, but like I look like what they're looking for, you know, if they think Antifa's going to, you know, I ride my bike on the gravel road, my bike has stickers on it, you know, I wear like punk clothes, I play in a punk band, you know, I am what they're looking for, but but they're also in my neighborhood. So like that's like a weird thing that I'm just, you know, that's the new adventure.
That I can't imagine what it would be like to be in that situation where people are afraid of you, right? They're afraid of you. And
Right.
what is that? I would struggle with that, and like how to move past it. And it's just a very interesting place that you're in.
Yeah, it is. But I think another thing, I mean, I think our relationships to each other and to other people, um, like, are going to need to change if we're going to solve any of these issues, racial justice or climate justice. And so it's like, if we can't learn to have conversations with like right-wing nut jobs, then they're going to stay right-wing nut jobs, and they're going to be hunting for me in my own neighborhood. So it's like, I don't know. I'm ready for that side of things, you know. If all the folks like me just hole up in cities, you know, then it's going to be the same thing it's the same issues are going to be perpetuated.
Yeah, I get that. And I think sometimes these narratives are kind of at cross purposes with each other. It's like, it can't just be true that like the disinformation and the militias are the only, you know, narrative, right? Because I'm here in Portland and I see my rural neighbors coming to my community for help, and I see my neighbors going and helping them. So this all can't be true, right? Like there's different things happening. But I know that you're super arty, like you mentioned your band. How does this all feed into your artistic life to have, you know, gone off into the woods? Are you're having the Walden Pond experience out there, or what's happening?
Yeah, you're not the first one to make that comparison. I mean, yeah, I would say my primary sort of way I spend time is making art. And I'm a primarily musician. My current band, actually, right now that I'm most active with is called Foraging. And I play like folk music with my partner, kind of like bluegrass, really, you know, music for living in the country. Embraced it. But I think a lot of the lyrics, especially lately, I've been really enjoying using kind of nature metaphors, like talking about nature, but not talking about nature, actually talking about human issues that I'm sort of processing, like what's going on in the world, both the racial justice and climate justice, through songwriting. So I moved out of the woods to write prettier music, because when I'm in a prettier place, I write prettier music.
Funny how that happens.
Yeah.
Well, does anyone out there have more questions? I feel like I'm monopolizing this person. Pipe up if you got them. I'm prepared to.
Well, I'm happy to jump us off and do the first awkward questions.
Great.
I was reading the book. I've got it here in my room. And there was a line really early in the book that I found really interesting, and it was about Kiran, and it was, let me see, Kiran believes that if you truly mean to make change, to agitate, you rattle all the doors, even the front door. And I noticed this was something that came up later in the book too. This seemed to be this recurring theme. So I guess this is a question for Kiran. What doors do you think still need to be rattled, if any? Or what doors do you hope to see rattled?
Well, boy, that's a big question. I mean, I think there's a lot of doors. I know people are talking a lot about politics lately, and we've seen kind of a really interesting, you know, first with Trump, and I'm sure that comes up in the book at some point, because I think that was the biggest deal at some point before the pandemic, before all these other things. And we're just seeing how the political system is kind of failing us. Like, our two political candidates are both old white men with like moderate to conservative viewpoints, probably are not going to like do a lot to change our energy systems as radically as we need them to, if we want to change climate change, if we want to mitigate climate change, or at least help the people who are suffering the most from it, I think is where we're at now. So I think sort of a redistribution of power is what I'm most interested in. That looks like a lot of different things. I have like locked myself and dangled myself in front of, ships carrying pipeline equipment. I've locked myself to train tracks, and I've done kind of like crazy things like that. And then there's also like, moving to the country as a brown queer person. It's like, I think there's a lot of ways to rattle doors. And so if you want to put it that way. But I think finding I think like just figuring out what's wrong in your community and what needs to be addressed is like, that can look really different in different ways. And also being open to the ways that could look different from what you're expecting. Like, a lot of folks have been talking about the riots, especially around this kind of BLM uprising. And one of the things that kind of really kicked it off in the beginning, if you remember, is the burning of the precinct in Minneapolis. And that was a point of tension, of course, because some people didn't like that. Some people were terrified by that. Some people were angered by that. Some people were empowered by that. But the reality is, the last time I visited the doctor on Zoom, of course, I was talking to the doctor, and one of the first things he says to me is like, I'm just like I'm an old white man. He was like recognizing his privilege, and that has never happened to me. Like an old white man actually being like, nice to meet you. I recognize my positionality, and maybe I don't know things like that. Just like white men like are, privilege is a blind spot, right? It's not, it's not a bad thing inherently, but it's like not recognizing your privilege, not recognizing your positionality is like, that is like, it's not allowed anymore. And if they hadn't burned down the precinct, then I don't think that would have happened, because folks have been talking about these things for a long time. And then they burnt a police precinct, and now it's like every random white guy I talk to is like aware to some little extent. And so I think the biggest thing is like when you hear about things like that, because when you hear about, riots or looting or property destruction, it's like, it might sound scary, but it's like, what's the impact it's having? And as a person of color, the impact that I'm seeing from like burning precincts is like very positive. And I'm not sure I'm not condoning property destruction or whatever. I'm just saying it's like, sometimes rattling those doors is like, creates necessary tension.
That was a very helpful answer. Thank you. Well, and I think that's been like a theme of the book and of this conversation too, is this pervasive hopefulness of, things can change. We can get to this point. You mentioned something interesting in your answer, and I don't want to make this conversation all about the election at all, but you did talk about the election a little bit. And of course, we had our first presidential debate. They did not talk a whole lot about climate change. Do you have thoughts you want to share about that? Do you have anything you hope for with the election or the outcomes of policy specifically in this round, or is your effort more on these grassroots movements or these more local efforts?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, it's like I have a lot of friends who don't want to have anything to do with politics. And in some ways I might be more in that boat, but I also recognize that it's like playing, like whoever controls the dominant narrative holds a lot of power in society. So it's like we can't really ignore what the politicians are doing as much as we want to. And so I think the lawsuit, coming back to the lawsuit, that was kind of an interesting in for me when I first heard about that, is because it was like, it's working within the system. It's like basically the point of the lawsuit is like, clearly like politicians have not done what they should be doing. Many of that has been from corruption in the fossil fuel industry and politics, money where it shouldn't be, right? And so, but there is a way to kind of check that system of power, and that we've set up, and it's the court system. And so it's like, can we, basically can we sue the government to be like, okay, you are breaking the Constitution because you're hurting people and you're not doing anything about it. And we've done the lobbying, we've done, trying to get people elected, and none of that's worked. And so what's interesting with the lawsuit is it was like, when I signed on, it was like, okay, like this is like the next step, right? How I laid out in the beginning. It's like, first you go through like the mainstream sort of political arena, then you try and check the power of the political arena, and then you just have to completely subvert, the politicians. And I think what's interesting about the lawsuit, and what you'll learn about in the book, is that their answer to our attempt for justice was to just stall and stall and stall and stall. And so we have had 3 trial dates set over the last couple years. The case has been going on since 2015. All the trial dates have been pushed back. We've been in all 3 levels of court multiple times. I think we've been to the Ninth Circuit court like 12 or 13 or 14 times now, just hearing whether we can have a trial, right? So we go and we ask, can we have a trial? And they say, maybe. And then they say yes. And then they say, oh, but not this. And so it's like, it's very, complicated. I've learned a lot of new legal words, but none of it really matters. I think if you look at the bigger picture, it's like their answer to us trying to check their power is to just stall until the problem, and with climate change, it's like stalling is essentially playing their side. And we even told the courts that we were like, stalling, like preventing this case from going to trial is supporting the defendants against the plaintiffs. And so as far as like politics, it's like, I think just be aware where it's failed is like, because then once we realize where we failed, we realize where we can, fix things.
So no pressure to give us any spoilers of the book, but you said that it's been stalled. What is are you going to court? Is it over?
No, well, that's the thing. It's not over. We're still waiting to hear. So we had a hearing in early summer, I think, was our last hearing. And maybe it was like, it was like even longer ago than that. I don't even remember, because I've been thinking about like
June of last year, and then you had a decision in January.
We had a decision in January. That's what it was. But we're waiting for another decision now.
Okay.
So that's the thing. It's like from like the same folks who've already given us 12 decisions over the last 7 years. So I'm not saying the case hasn't failed. The case is kind of illustrating how hesitant the federal government is to deal with this issue. And I think it's making a very good example of that unfortunate fact.
Sure. I have a question here from Bryn, who just wrote it out. She asked, how would both Lee and Kiran suggest entering discourse regarding the weight of climate change with people, so family or friends or acquaintances, who are resistant to engaging in open conversation or just don't believe in climate change at all? Do you have thoughts on that?
Do you want to take that, Lee?
Well, you're probably going to have a better answer than I do, because you have more experience with it. I mean, it's been kind of really interesting for me. I mean, I work a lot in rural areas, and I did this summer. Of course, I was working on the Jordan Cove project, so I was in Southern Oregon for a bit, and working with sources in Southern Oregon where I think the value system in pockets, right, as you describe it in the rural area you're in, Kiran, it's really different. And, I think what I have learned is you just got to meet people around the values that you agree on and build your relationship around those things. And then you kind of get to where you can talk to each other. It's a bit of a dance, right? You figure out what you like about each other first, and you figure out where you share common interests and common values first. And then you have more of a conversation about these other things, and try to keep that as non-reactive as you can. I heard a really interesting piece of advice, and it came from a podcast called 10% Happier. It's about meditation. And one of the guests was saying, there's a really big difference between being politically active and being partisan. And it's such a good thing to say, it's like, because you can care about all these things, and you can have your opinions, and you can understand things, but if you're reflexively partisan, no one hears you, right? So to just stay in that space where it's like you're politically active, you're engaged, you know what you're talking about, but you're not just like getting into like that everybody in their corner thing. I mean, that's the part that I try to avoid. I'll let you know how it turns out.
I would agree. I would probably echo all the things you said. I'd also say I think our society is just going to simply grow out of climate denialism. I think it was a specific political agenda or financial agenda by the fossil fuel industry to brainwash people and to muddy the science and stuff, and it impacted a ton of people. And that's why I get this question all the time when I get talked about the case, like, how do you talk to people about climate change who don't believe in it? But frankly, some of the organizing that I've seen especially recently, that I've been most excited about has been carried out by folks who are under, in their teens and early 20s. Some of the most interesting organizing that I've seen that I think has the most kind of potential to impact change. And I think that the climate denialism is just not, like, I'm sure there's folks my age who don't believe in climate change, but it's way less than if you went and talked to the folks who are like, I don't know, in the boomer generation, for example, or even my parents' generation. So I think, frankly, like, people ask me about it so much that I'm like, wow, so many people are worried about people who don't believe in climate change. Frankly, I'm not that worried about it. I just think we need to, I just think we just need to harness the power of all the young folks who are already out there organizing and who want to change things, and that's how it's going to change. Like, folks who are too stuck in that sort of partisan world where they believe whatever their political party sort of says is like that too, I think, is kind of going out of vogue, at least with the young folks. But I think just recognizing the power of young people, which is another point of our case, is like we're all youth. I'm only 23. Signed on when I was 18, so it's like, and the case hasn't solved anything yet, but it's a tactic. It's an attempt to change things. And there's so many young people who are attempting to change things. And I think that's where the change is going to come from. So, like, old people who don't believe in climate change are diminishing. And frankly, I think we just need to make them irrelevant. Not in like an active like negativity towards them, but just by like doing what we need to do to solve the issues, and they will become irrelevant. I'm just, I mean, I've been in the environmental movement long enough that most of the people, I have family who maybe doesn't believe in climate change, but that's not what we talk about, because those relationships are important, so don't go around destroying relationships, but it's like, do the work that needs to be done. And like, I have a lot of hope for the young folks, frankly. And I have 2 younger siblings who are very active, and it's like, them and their friends are like the future, like both literally and figuratively.
Related question that I just got from Maya, and speaking of these things that you're talking about, especially with like relationships and with having these conversations, have you seen a shift in anyone's mentality about climate change, specifically referring to someone who's really far right? Kiran, I think you referred to them as right-wing nut jobs. What does that type of change look like? Do you see it in the course of a conversation, or is this more of like a social shift that you're really talking about?
I have a friend who grew up very conservative Christian. They describe it as a cult, basically, but I think their experience is perhaps not as uncommon as some might think it is. And were told that climate change was not real, and then they went to college studying music, and then they took a biology class or something like that, and started to learn things, and were immediately activated, and have been one of the most active environmental organizers I've known for the last 2 or 3 years, I think now. And they're around my age, maybe a year younger. And so, when people wake up and they've realize that they've had like blinds pulled over their eyes, like that can be a point of sort of inspiration to like really do something about it. So I've seen that happen. I've also known a lot of folks who haven't had that experience. I'm sure that experience is not very common, but that's kind of what I'm talking about with the generational shift. It's like you can only pull the blinds over young people's eyes for so long before they break out of it.
Great, thanks. Oh no, go ahead.
And there's actual data supporting, what you're saying. That younger people are coming into this conversation with much more experience and knowledge about climate change and believe much more readily is absolutely proven out. And one of the things that we also saw this summer in Portland that I thought was so fascinating was the Zenith 5 trial, which was a group of 5 activists who had blocked the transport of oil pipe infrastructure in a rail yard. They brought like a dump truck out, and they dumped like a pile of dirt and actually planted a garden in like a couple of hours, and then put a scarecrow out in a little shed and sat around with their lawn implements. Like, it was really photogenic and cute. And they went to trial, and they didn't plead guilty. They pled not guilty, but they used a climate necessity defense, basically saying Yeah, we did it, but we had no choice. And they ran through these things that Karen talked about, like through, they went through the political door, they went through the lobbying door, they went through the door of the court, and they didn't have any success. And they felt that their next step was direct action and that they were driven to it. And they had scientists come into the court and present the science to the jury along with these images of these folks. They played video of them doing this, like totally admitted, like, we planted this garden, it was a wonderful day, but we did obstruct this train, and it was a hung jury. You know, so to have 12 people in a courtroom listening to that story, having the defendant sitting there and saying, oh yeah, we totally did it, we absolutely did it, we admit it, but we did it for a good reason. After hearing the science, being able to, like, a jury could not agree that that was a crime. That's huge. Like, that does signal that this conversation is going somewhere new, I think.
That is huge.
It's really fun to watch too.
Out of curiosity, Lee, did you hear about that story as a journalist, or did you just happen to see it in the news?
Oh, I covered the trial.
Oh, okay. Very interesting.
So, you know, yeah, I got a gig working the case, so I got to sit there for the whole trial. It was good. It was really great. It was so informative.
I believe it. Yeah.
And theatrical.
Does anyone else in the audience have any questions they want to ask as we're starting to get towards the end of tonight's event? I don't hear anything. I have a few more questions I can ask, but all right, I guess one really big question that I have then, and I think this can be a final question depending on, you know, how it goes. I know, you know, you both have spoken a lot about youth activists fighting for climate change, and you've spoken a lot about activist efforts really broadly. Do either of you have any advice or any thoughts you would like to pass on to youth activists or activists broadly moving forward? Oh, and I also see another question in the chat to ask after this too, so this is not your parting words.
I mean, I always feel like the young people are carrying too much weight here. You know, I mean, like, to have the youngest plaintiff in this lawsuit is now only 13 years old. He's been at this since he was 8. He's so active. And, you know, he's growing up with this in a way that is just like, I think it's amazing, and I so admire him and his work and his family, but sometimes it's just galling, like the amount of work that this little kid is doing, basically because of a total abdication of adult responsibility. Like, if I had any advice for kids, it would be to say that to the adults around them and really start pulling, I don't know. I mean, I think older people need to be called out for sitting on their hands. Like, and I mean, Kiran, you could speak to this too, but I've heard from, I can't recall if it's you, but certainly others of your plaintiffs, about people saying to you guys, you're our last hope, oh thank God, you know, this will save us.
Oh, yeah.
And that's just so, you know, now I can continue to do nothing. Like, that's really not cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, those are definitely good points. I would say, like, especially speaking to young folks, like, yeah, like, try and balance out, like, find something, like, for me, it's, like, definitely music and, like, being in nature, but, like, specifically, like, dealing with hard things from a young age. Like, I got activated when I was, like, 16, like, started, like, getting involved in, like, pretty serious stuff, serious issues, and, like, addressing serious issues in serious ways. And, like, I have, like, heavily relied on music for my mental health reasons, you know, to process the world. And it's, like, obviously it's not music for everyone, but it's, like, find some way to, like, process what's going on, especially if you're willing to get into this work, because I don't think there should be a pressure for especially young folks. Like, you don't have to, you know, start getting arrested in your teens, you know, you don't have to do that if you don't feel inspired to, but if you do, all the best to you, and like like, try and find some way to balance that out and process, like, how you feel, because if you don't do that, I don't know, I worry about folks for sure.
One last question for Lee, from Melanie Oommen. How do you decide what you're going to report on?
You know, it's hard. I mean, sometimes, like I've had lists. I had a process before I decided to write this book where I literally went through like everything I'd ever written, honestly, like going back through even like the middle school notebooks, and like made lists of the themes and tried to identify like, you know, where I had been drawn and what sort of defining things had been a theme in my work. And then also how I like to work. And I like to work outside. I like to work with people who are really interesting people and have fun stories to tell. I also like to do a fair amount of investigating. And environmental stories just kind of really speak to me because for me, I think they pull together all of those things. And they often boil down to these stories about who benefits and who pays. And I think that those are the most important stories I can be doing. So that's often how I choose. I mean, I just want it to seem like a good experience, and I also want to be welcomed in this story, unless it's an accountability story where I'm writing about something that's thoroughly egregious and that's the reason to do it and to, you know, beat on the door. If I'm going to be storytelling about a group of people like this group of plaintiffs, I don't you know, want to force myself into that role either. So it's a combination of considering those things.
Thank you for your answer. Hey, thank you both for all of your answers tonight. This has been a great event. Thank you so much for coming, everyone in the audience. This was a fascinating talk with Lee and Kiran, and very hopeful. And to both of you, I really appreciate your insight and your awareness and your willingness to share your time with us. To our audience members, please support Lee and Kiran and read more about these activist efforts by buying their book, As the World Burns, Here with Us. You can find it on top of the Grassroots homepage, the link I pasted into the chat, or even under our events page. Your support helps small indie bookstores like us stay open and bring authors into the community. So on that note, thanks again, everyone. We hope to see you back for more events soon. I'm gonna end the Zoom meeting now.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.